The air in the town hall felt heavy that evening, not because it was hot, though the late summer heat clung to everyone's skin, but because something important was about to happen, and everyone in Hollow Creek knew it. The room was packed, not with outsiders or reporters, but with people who'd lived here for decades, some even their whole lives, farmers with dirt still under their nails, elders who remembered when the road out of town was just a dirt path, teenagers who'd never known a world without the wetlands humming behind their backyards. They'd all come to speak, to be heard. Up front, behind a long wooden table, sat the Regional Development Council. They wore crisp shirts, carried leather folders, and spoke in calm, measured tones that sounded more like they were discussing stock prices than someone's home. For weeks, rumors had swirled about the Greenfield Expansion Project, a plan to drain the wetlands just east of town and build a luxury resort with solar panels on the roof and a tech innovation hub nearby. Green, they called it. Sustainable. Progress. But to the people of Hollow Creek, the wetlands weren't just land. They were where kids learned to fish, where herons nested each spring, where the water filtered clean before flowing into the river that fed half the county. Grandparents had taught their grandchildren to identify cattails and listen for frog songs at dusk. The place held memories, not just mud and reeds. When the public comment period opened, one by one, people stood up. A retired schoolteacher explained how the wetlands acted as a natural flood barrier during heavy rains. A young woman, barely 20, shared how she'd tracked rare bird species there for her biology project. An older man, voice shaking slightly, said his family had buried their stillborn child near the old willow tree over 100 years ago. "That ground is sacred to us," he said simply. The council members nodded politely. Some took notes, but their eyes kept drifting to the clock. One official even whispered to another, loud enough for the front row to hear, "We've heard enough sentiment." Another sighed and shuffled papers like he was waiting for a train to arrive. Then came the vote. No debate. No real discussion. Just a quick roll call. Aye, aye, aye. The gavel came down with a sharp crack that echoed like a door slamming shut. Approved. Unanimous. For a few seconds, the room was completely still. No gasps, no shouts, no chairs scraping back. Just silence. Not the kind of silence that means surrender, but the kind that comes when words suddenly feel useless. Like shouting into a storm. People didn't leave angrily. They left quietly, shoulders slumped, eyes down. Outside, the sun was setting, painting the sky in soft oranges and purples, the same colors that always lit up the wetlands at dusk. Someone paused on the steps, looked back at the town hall, then turned and walked home without a word. At the general store the next morning, the usual chatter was gone. No one talked about the weather or whose tomatoes were ripening first. The cashier handed over change without meeting anyone's eyes. At the post office, neighbors nodded but didn't stop to chat like they always used to. Even the kids on their bikes rode slower, quieter, as if the whole town was holding its breath. The council thought they'd won. They'd followed procedure. They'd checked the boxes. They'd listened, technically. And now, with the paperwork signed and the developers ready to move in, they assumed life in Hollow Creek would go on as usual, just with a new economic opportunity on the horizon. But they didn't understand something crucial. When you tell people their home, their history, their quiet way of life doesn't matter. You don't just make them angry, you make them withdraw. And that kind of silence? It's louder than any protest. News of the decision spread fast. Contractors showed up with survey stakes and bright orange tape. They marked trees for removal, measured distances with laser tools, and parked their trucks right at the edge of the wetlands. But no one from Hollow Creek came to argue. No one yelled or blocked the road. Instead, they simply disappeared from the places they used to be. The community garden sat untended. The weekly potluck was canceled. Even the church bell, which usually rang every Sunday morning, stayed silent. At first, the workers didn't notice. They assumed the locals were just sulking. But after a few days, the absence started to feel strange. Eerie, Ava. One foreman later admitted he kept glancing over his shoulder, expecting someone to appear, but the path stayed empty. The only sounds were the wind through the reeds and the distant cry of a red-winged blackbird. Back in the council chambers, the mood was celebratory. Press releases were drafted. Handshakes were exchanged. "This will bring jobs," one official said confidently to a local news crew. "Modern infrastructure. A brighter future." But that brighter future felt cold to the people who actually lived there. Because to them, the future had always been tied to that wetland, the way the mist rose off the water at dawn, the smell of wet earth after rain, the knowledge that their children would one day show their own kids how to skip stones across the same pond. Now, all that was marked for destruction. And not because it wasn't valuable, but because its value couldn't be counted in dollars or tax revenue. What the council didn't realize was that silence isn't empty. It's full of meaning, and in Hollow Creek that silence was building, like water behind a dam. It wasn't the end of the story. It was the beginning of something they never saw coming, because sometimes the most powerful thing people can do isn't to speak up, but to stop speaking altogether. To remove themselves from a system that only pretends to listen, and when an entire community does that at once, it doesn't just create quiet. It creates a void so loud even the most confident leaders start to wonder if they made a terrible mistake. But that realization wouldn't come yet. Not in those first few days. For now, the council celebrated. The developers measured. And Hollow Creek? Hollow Creek waited, watched, and said nothing at all. In the days after the vote, something strange happened in Hollow Creek. Not loud or dramatic, but quiet in a way that made people uneasy. The town didn't erupt in anger. There were no marches, no signs nailed to fences, no shouting at council meetings. Instead, the people simply stopped showing up. It started small. The weekly farmers' market, usually buzzing by 8 a.m. with neighbors swapping zucchini for eggs and kids licking honey off their fingers, opened to near-empty stalls. Only 2 vendors showed up. The rest just stayed home. Their absence wasn't announced. No one posted on the community board or sent group texts. They just didn't come. And that silence spoke louder than any protest sign ever could. At the post office, the usual morning crowd vanished. The clerk, who'd spent 20 years greeting everyone by name, now stood behind the counter with nothing to do but watch dust float in the sunlight. Even the school bus sat idle. Parents had quietly pulled their kids out, not in defiance, but in sorrow. If they don't care about our land, one parent told a neighbor, why would they care about our children's future? The school principal didn't argue. He just nodded, eyes tired. The church, usually full on Sundays, held services to rows of empty pews. The pastor didn't preach about anger or justice. He just read a passage about listening and then sat in silence for 10 minutes. No hymns, no offering plate passed. Just stillness. People who came later said the quiet felt heavier than any sermon. Outside town, the construction crew kept working. They hammered stakes into the ground, rolled out blueprints on the hoods of their trucks, and talked about timelines and budgets. But even they began to feel it, the absence. One worker noticed that the usual curious kids who used to watch from the tree line were gone. Another missed the old man who used to bring them cold lemonade every afternoon without saying a word. Now the road to the wetlands felt lonely, like walking through a place that had already been forgotten. What made it eerie wasn't just that people disappeared. It was how completely they withdrew. No calls to the mayor's office. No letters to the paper. No social media rants. It was as if the entire community had decided, without a single meeting, that words were useless. If their voices had been ignored when they spoke, then maybe their silence would be harder to ignore. And it worked. People from nearby towns started noticing. A delivery driver who came twice a week said the general store felt like a ghost town. A nurse who visited elderly residents reported that even the usual small talk over tea had stopped. They're not angry, she told a friend. They're just gone. That word spread. Gone. Not physically, but emotionally, like they'd pulled a curtain around themselves and stepped behind it. The local newspaper tried to write a story, but no one would talk. Reporters knocked on doors, but curtains stayed drawn. When they asked questions at the gas station, the attendant just shrugged and said, "Ask the council. They know everything, don't they?" His tone wasn't rude, just flat, like he'd run out of hope. Even the sounds of daily life changed. No more screen doors slamming. No laughter from backyards. No radios playing old country songs while someone fixed a fence. At night, instead of porch lights glowing warm and yellow, most houses stayed dark. It wasn't a boycott in the usual sense. It was something deeper, a quiet refusal to participate in a world that had erased them. The council, meanwhile, remained confident. "They'll come around," one member told a colleague over coffee. "Once they see the jobs coming, they'll understand." But the jobs hadn't come yet. only the noise of bulldozers warming up in the distance. Then something unexpected happened. A young couple who ran the town's only cafe closed their doors, not with a sign saying protest or closed until justice, but with a simple note taped to the window, taking time to listen. Inside, the chairs were neatly stacked. The coffee machine was unplugged. The silence inside felt respectful, not rebellious. That note sparked something. Not in Hollow Creek because they already knew, but in the outside world. Someone took a photo of it and posted it online. At first it got a few likes, then a local journalist shared it. Then a teacher from the next county. Within 2 days, taking time to listen was trending in regional news feeds. People started asking, listen to what? Suddenly Hollow Creek wasn't just a dot on a map anymore. It became a question. Why would an entire town go quiet? What had they been trying to say that no one heard? Reporters began showing up. Not the big city kind with cameras and microphones, but local journalists who remembered fishing in those wetlands as kids. They didn't push for interviews. They just sat on benches, watched, and wrote what they saw. One article described the town as a community holding its breath. Another called the silence a language the powerful don't understand. Back in the council chambers, the mood shifted slightly. Emails started piling up. Not angry ones, but confused, concerned messages from voters in other districts. Is this really necessary? One read. My grandmother used to pick berries there. A city councilor from a neighboring town called privately, asking if there'd been a mistake. The developers grew nervous. Investors asked for reassurance. Public perception matters, one warned. But the people of Hollow Creek didn't care about perception. They weren't performing. This wasn't a tactic they'd read about online. It was something older, deeper, like the way animals go still before a storm. They weren't trying to win. They were trying to survive with their dignity intact. And in that stillness, something powerful grew. Not rage, not violence, but a kind of moral weight that pressed down on everyone who passed through. Visitors said they felt watched, not by people, but by the land itself. The wind through the cattails sounded like a whisper. The empty swings in the schoolyard creaked like a question. Even the wildlife seemed to notice. Deer wandered closer to the road. A great blue heron stood for hours at the edge of the marked construction zone, unmoving as if guarding something sacred. Locals saw it and didn't say a word, but they knew. The silence wasn't empty. It was full of memory, of love, of generations who'd lived lightly on that land and asked for nothing in return. And now, by refusing to speak, they were forcing others to finally pay attention. Not to their words, but to their absence. Because when a whole community goes quiet, the world starts to wonder, what did we do to make them stop talking? And that question, simple as it was, began to echo far beyond Hollow Creek, into meeting rooms, newsrooms, and the quiet corners of people's consciences. The council had thought they'd silenced opposition with a vote, but they hadn't counted on the power of a silence that refused to be ignored. The silence from Hollow Creek didn't just linger, it spread. Like ripples from a stone dropped in still water, it reached places no one expected. At first, the construction crew tried to ignore it. They showed up every morning, boots muddy, coffee in hand, ready to clear the first patch of wetland. But something felt off. The usual hum of small-town life, the distant bark of a dog, the rumble of a tractor, kids shouting from a porch, was gone. Only the wind answered them now, rustling through reeds that had stood for longer than anyone could remember. Then the workers started quitting. Not all at once, but one by one. A veteran foreman packed up his tools after finding a row of small, smooth stones laid neatly along the edge of the site, each one placed with care, like a message without words. He didn't say why he left. He just handed back his badge and drove off without looking back. Another worker told his buddy over lunch, "It feels like we're tearing down a church." That phrase stuck. Soon rumors floated through the crew, that the land was cursed, that the quiet was watching them, that they were doing something wrong they couldn't take back. Meanwhile, something else was happening, something the council never saw coming. A junior staffer, someone who'd been taking notes at every meeting, couldn't sleep. She kept replaying the way the elders had spoken, how their voices cracked not with anger but with grief. One night, she dug through archived emails and found messages between council members that had never been made public. In one, an official wrote, "Let them cry. Once the bulldozers roll, they'll forget." In another, Sentiment doesn't pay taxes. She didn't leak them out of spite. She did it because she couldn't live with herself anymore. She sent the messages to a local journalist she trusted, not with a dramatic note, just a simple line. You should see this. Within hours, the story exploded. Not on national news, but on community radio, local blogs, shared in group chats and pinned to bulletin boards in grocery stores. People read those words and felt sick. It wasn't just about wetlands anymore. It was about respect, about whether ordinary people's lives mattered when big decisions were made behind closed doors. Suddenly, the greenfield expansion didn't sound green at all. It sounded greedy. Environmental groups that had stayed quiet before now spoke up, not with slogans, but with facts. Scientists explained how draining the wetlands would hurt water quality for dozens of towns downstream. Historians shared old photos of families farming that land before the county even had paved roads. Even business owners from nearby cities voiced concern. If they'll ignore Hollow Creek, one wrote online, who's next? The investors got nervous. One pulled out quietly, then another. The resort company issued a bland statement about reassessing timelines, but everyone knew what it meant. They were backing away. The council tried to hold a press conference to clarify the facts, but only 3 reporters showed up, and their questions were sharp. Did you really call residents backward? Why wasn't their ancestral connection considered? Who gave you the right to decide what's valuable? Back in Hollow Creek, nothing changed outwardly. Porches stayed empty. Doors stayed closed. But something inside the town had shifted. The silence wasn't just pain anymore, it was power. People began leaving small things at the edge of the marked construction zone. A child's drawing of a heron, a jar of wildflower honey, a pair of worn work gloves. No notes, no demands, just offerings, like quiet prayers. A school teacher from the next county brought her students to the roadside, not to protest, but to observe. Look, she told them, this is what happens when people stop pretending everything's fine. The kids stood quietly, watching the empty fields, listening to the birds. One asked, why don't they just yell? The teacher smiled sadly. Sometimes, she said, the loudest thing you can do is stop talking. Social media filled with photos of the empty chairs people had placed facing the wetlands. Simple wooden chairs, some with faded cushions, each with a name handwritten on a tag tied to the back. Not famous names. Just names like Martha, 1923-2010, or Tommy, who loved frogs. People shared them with just 2 words. Remember us. And the world did remember. A documentary filmmaker showed up with a small camera and asked no questions. Just filmed the light on the water at dawn, the empty swings, the way mist rose off the land like breath. That short film got thousands of views. Comments poured in. This broke my heart. We've all ignored someone's silence. What if we listened sooner? The council scrambled. They called emergency meetings. They drafted new statements full of words like community engagement and inclusive planning. But it was too late. The trust was gone. And worse, people outside Hollow Creek were starting to see themselves in this story. The nurse who felt ignored by hospital administrators. The farmer whose land was threatened by a new highway. The elder whose neighborhood was being redeveloped without asking. Hollow Creek became a mirror. Even the weather seemed to join the quiet protest. Rain fell softly for 3 days straight. Not a storm. Just a gentle, steady hush that soaked the orange survey tape until it bled into the soil like a wound healing. Workers tried to reset the markers, but the rain kept washing them away. Some took it as a sign, others just felt tired. One evening, a local radio host played an hour of pure field recordings from the wetlands. Frogs croaking, wind in the reeds, the distant call of a loon. No music, no commentary, just sound. Listeners called in crying. I forgot how beautiful quiet could be, one said. We've been so loud we forgot how to listen. And that was the heart of it. Hollow Creek hadn't just gone silent. They'd created a space where others could finally hear what had been drowned out for years. The value of slowness, of memory, of land that holds more than profit. The council had thought progress meant noise, machines, meetings, announcements. But real progress, it turned out, sometimes began in stillness. By the end of the week, the head of the development firm canceled a major investor call. When asked why, he just said, "The numbers don't lie, but neither does the feeling in your gut." The silence had done its work. Not by fighting, not by shouting, but by refusing to play along until the world had no choice but to stop, look, and finally understand. Some things can't be replaced, and some silences can't be ignored. The council didn't call the meeting out of kindness. They called it because they were running out of options. Investors were pulling back. News stories kept coming. Even their own staff looked uneasy in the hallways. So they did the only thing they could think of. They asked to meet with the people of Hollow Creek. Not in the big government building downtown, but right there, in the town's own community hall. The one with the creaky floorboards and the old piano in the corner that hadn't been played in years. They expected a crowd, maybe anger, maybe demands. They came prepared with folders full of revised plans, promises of shared benefits and a new logo for the project that now included the word partnership. They even brought bottled water and name tags. But when they walked in, the room was almost empty. Just one person sat near the front on a simple wooden chair. No entourage. No microphone, no sign. She was old, so old her hands trembled slightly, but her back was straight and her eyes were clear. She wore a faded dress and a shawl knitted long ago, and on her lap rested a small leather-bound book tied with a ribbon. The council members exchanged glances. Was this a trick, a setup? They shuffled in, set their folders on the table, cleared their throats. One of them stepped forward, smiling politely. "Thank you for meeting with us," he said. "We'd like to discuss how we can move forward together." The woman didn't stand. She didn't raise her voice. She just looked at them, not with hate, but with a kind of deep, quiet sadness, as if she'd seen this story before many times. Then slowly she untied the ribbon and opened the book. It wasn't a diary or a journal. It was a land deed, yellowed with age, written in careful script, signed by hand over 100 years ago. She placed it gently on the table in front of them. "This land," she said, her voice soft but steady, "was never yours to give away." She didn't shout. She didn't list grievances. She simply told them what they hadn't bothered to ask, that her family had cared for this place long before there were roads or power lines, that they'd buried their dead near the old willow, that they'd watched the seasons turn in the same rhythm for generations, not because they were stuck in the past, but because they understood something the council seemed to have forgotten. That some things aren't meant to be owned, only tended. "We never asked for money," she said. "We never asked for fame. We only asked to be left in peace, to keep doing what we've always done. Protect what's been given to us." She paused, letting the words settle like dust in sunlight. "You called us backward. You said we didn't understand progress, but real progress doesn't erase what came before. It builds on it, with care." Then she closed the book, stood slowly, and walked out. No dramatic exit. No slamming door. Just the soft tap of her shoes on the wooden floor fading into silence. The council sat frozen. One of them reached out and touched the deed as if to prove it was real. Another stared at the empty chair where she'd been, his face pale. For the first time, they weren't looking at data or budgets or timelines. They were looking at a truth they'd ignored for too long. Outside, something unexpected happened. A local journalist, one who'd been quietly covering the story for weeks, had been waiting on the steps. He hadn't recorded the meeting out of respect. But when the woman stepped out, he simply asked, "May I share what you said?" She nodded once. He didn't need more. By that evening, her words were everywhere. Not twisted or edited, just spoken plainly the way she'd said them. People shared the clip not with outrage, but with reverence. "Listen to this," they wrote. Just listen. And people did. Within hours, calls flooded the governor's office. Not angry shouts, but calm, firm voices. Teachers, nurses, small business owners, even retired soldiers. "This isn't right," they said. "Fix it." The next morning, the governor announced a full halt to the project, pending a new review that would include historians, ecologists, and for the first time, the people of Hollow Creek as equal partners. 2 days later, 3 council members resigned, not with grand speeches, but with quiet letters saying they'd misjudged the situation. One admitted in a private conversation that he hadn't slept since the meeting. "I kept seeing that empty chair," he said. "It haunted me. Back in Hollow Creek, life didn't suddenly return to normal, but something had shifted." Porch lights came back on. The school bus started running again. At the general store, someone finally laughed, A real warm laugh that made others smile without knowing why. The silence hadn't ended. It had just changed shape. Now it held space for healing, not just hurt. The construction site sat untouched. The orange tape sagged in the rain. The bulldozers gathered dust. And the wetlands? They kept breathing. Frogs singing at dusk, herons wading in the shallows, mist rising like a promise at dawn. What happened in that community hall wasn't a victory in the usual sense. There were no trophies, no headlines declaring David beats Goliath, but something deeper had been restored. Dignity, respect, the understanding that you don't have to shout to be heard. Sometimes, you just have to stand your ground in silence until the world finally turns to look. And the council, they learned the hardest lesson of all. That regret doesn't come from losing a vote or a contract. It comes from realizing too late that you dismissed someone's whole world as unimportant, and that the quiet you ignored was actually a warning. Now, when they drove past Hollow Creek, they didn't see undeveloped land, they saw a home. And for the first time, they understood why no amount of money could ever replace it. Months passed, and the wetlands of Hollow Creek didn't just survive, they began to thrive. Without the threat of bulldozers and concrete, the land seemed to breathe easier. Cattails grew taller. Dragonflies returned in shimmering clouds. Even the water ran clearer, as if the earth itself was sighing in relief. But the real change wasn't just in the land, it was in the people, and in the way decisions were made from that point on. The project was officially canceled. Not paused, not delayed, canceled. The governor's office made it clear. No more development on that land without full community consent, and not just a quick vote at a meeting, but real, ongoing partnership. What surprised everyone was how quickly things moved once respect was part of the equation. Within weeks, a new agreement was signed. Hollow Creek would co-manage the wetlands with state environmental experts, blending old knowledge with new science. Elders taught young rangers which plants healed, which birds signaled clean water, and how to read the land like a living story. In return, biologists helped monitor water quality and track wildlife with tools the community had never had access to before. The council didn't disappear, but it changed. New rules required that any major decision affecting rural or historically overlooked communities must include representatives from those places at the table from day one, not as guests, not as stakeholders, but as equals. One of the first people invited to join the restructured council was the woman who'd walked into that meeting with nothing but a deed and her truth. She didn't take the seat for power. She took it so no one else would ever have to stand alone in silence again. Life in Hollow Creek slowly returned to its rhythm, but with a new layer of quiet pride. Kids once again played near the water's edge, not fearing it would vanish, but learning to protect it. School groups came from nearby towns to study the wetlands, not as a resource, but as a teacher. The community garden bloomed fuller than ever, with signs explaining which plants grew best near marshy soil and why. Even the cafe reopened, its chalkboard now reading, "Coffee brewed with water filtered by 200 years of wetland wisdom." People smiled when they saw it. It wasn't a slogan. It was a fact. Outside Hollow Creek, the ripple continued. Other small towns started asking harder questions when big plans came their way. "Did they really listen?" became a common phrase at kitchen tables and town halls. A farming community blocked a pipeline by simply refusing to sign, not with anger but with calm, collective no. A coastal village used Hollow Creek's story to protect their shoreline from luxury condos. The silence had become a language others were learning to speak. But perhaps the most powerful moment came on a cool autumn morning, nearly a year after the vote that almost destroyed everything. The council, new members and old, gathered not in a government building but at the edge of the wetlands. They didn't come with folders or speeches. They came to listen. A local elder stood before them, not to accuse but to invite. "Walk with us," she said. "See what we see." And they did. They walked barefoot on damp earth. They watched a great blue heron take flight. They tasted wild mint growing by the bank. One council member, who'd once called the land underutilized, knelt to touch the water and didn't say a word for a long time. Later, he admitted he'd never really looked at a place like this before, not as a problem to solve, but as something alive. There were no grand celebrations, no victory parades. Just a quiet understanding settling in like morning fog. The people of Hollow Creek didn't gloat. They knew their fight wasn't special. It was just one of many happening in quiet corners all over the world, wherever people refused to let their homes be erased for someone else's idea of progress. What stayed with everyone wasn't the anger or the fear, but the lesson: silence isn't weakness. Sometimes it's the strongest voice you have, especially when the world has stopped listening to words. And sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is not to shout, but to stop pretending everything's fine. Years later, visitors to the area would notice something unusual. At the entrance to the protected wetlands, there's no big sign with flashy letters, just a simple wooden post with carved words. This place remembers. Do you? People pause there. Some take photos. Others just stand quietly, listening to the wind, the water, the birds. And in that stillness, they understand what Hollow Creek knew all along. That land isn't just dirt and trees. It's memory. It's belonging. It's the quiet thread that ties generations together. The council never forgot that day in the empty hall. They kept the old deed, not as a legal document, but as a reminder. It sits now in a glass case at the county office, not hidden in a vault, but visible to anyone who walks by. Underneath it, a small plaque reads, "Progress begins when we stop talking over the people who've been here all along." Hollow Creek didn't change the world overnight, but it changed how people saw their own power. It proved that you don't need megaphones or millions to protect what matters. You just need to stand together, stay true, and sometimes say nothing at all, and in the end, that silence did what no protest ever could. It made the powerful finally understand that some things are not for sale, not for taking, and not for forgetting. The wetlands remained. The community endured, and the quiet became a kind of song, one that still echoes gently in every choice made with care, in every voice that chooses to listen before it speaks.